Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. On the program today, we have an amazing black cat story that will have you saying, amazing.
Amazing!
See? We have a friendly orb encounter and a classic science fiction story called The Odyssey of Sam Meecham.
Are you serious?
Why, yes, I am. We will end the show with another edition of Not So Important Times in History. And it all begins with this 2.5-minute mystery.
And now, a new 2.5-minute mystery.
This 2.5-minute mystery is being brought to you by the Blue Bayou Restaurant in Disneyland Park, California. Why? Well, it just happens to be my most favorite restaurant in the world, and I have some very fond memories eating there. Now, here is our story. It was the first day of school at Blue Bayou University. Everyone was glad to be back, but on that first day, someone murdered Malcolm White, the history teacher. Detective Reynolds began his investigation and came up with 4 fellow teachers at the school that had both motive and opportunity. The landscaper, seen arguing with White that very morning, the math teacher, a pinochle rival, the basketball coach, they just didn't get along, and the principal, who just doesn't like anybody. Each had an alibi. The landscaper said he was outside mowing the lawn. The math teacher said he was giving a mid-year test. The basketball coach said that he was running practice drills with his players, and the principal said that she was alone in her office. After hearing all of their alibis, Detective Reynolds arrested the killer immediately. Who killed Malcolm White? Did the killer hate history? And how did the detective know?
In just a minute, we'll have our solution. But first, a message from our sponsor.
Do you enjoy these 2.5-minute mysteries? Please let me know. Also, if you have one to share, I'd love to hear it. Go to ronsamazingstories.com and click on the Contact tab. And now, here is our solution. Did you figure it out? This one has a simple solution if you heard all the clues. The math teacher killed Malcolm White. He claimed he was giving a mid-year test, but it was the first day of school. That seems pretty unlikely. This 2.5-minute mystery was brought to you by the Blue Bayou Restaurant in Disneyland. This dining experience is one in a million. It sits in the middle of the park, right next to the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, in the swamp.
What's that you said?
The support I receive for the show each week has been amazing. I ask for stories, you send them in. I ask for feedback, you give it. But now, I'm going to ask for more. Am I crazy? I don't think so. We have 2 new segments on the show that I'm looking for help with. The first is the new 2.5-minute mysteries. The feedback on this so far has been pretty good. What I'm looking for here are your short, locked room or detective riddles. Reader's Digest made their fame on these in the early years of the magazine. They are short mysteries that ask the readers to solve a crime using only the clues given. If you have any of these or want to write your own, I'd love to have them. Keep in mind, you're not only limited to mysteries. Anything that has a short story that makes the listener guess the outcome would be welcome. The second new segment is Not So Important Times in History. This one made its debut on last week's podcast. It will take on the strange, unbelievable, and even funny events in history and tell them as a story. So, what am I looking for here? Your job is to help me track down these historical or hysterical events. I was amazed by just how many things are truly available for this category. Do you have a favorite? If you want to help with either of these, you can send your ideas and submissions to ronsamazingstories@gmail.com, or just head to the main website and click on the Contact tab. They both go to the same place. While on the subject of new segments, I have some news for you. Jason Dowd and myself got together to talk about the future of the Horror Express podcast. What we've decided is that the train ride into horror will occur only once per year during the month of Spooky, which is October. The reason for this all comes down to logistics. The amount of time required to produce that show is staggering. Hence, neither of us want to record the show and keep putting it off. What we've decided to do is replace the Horror Express with a new segment called The Paranormal with Jason. It will take on all kinds of topics and stories, and we're both pretty excited about it. We had planned to record the pilot this last week, but things happened to both of us. For me, it was a very damaging snowstorm that put a tree limb through my roof. Very bad timing, that. So be looking for that pilot pretty soon. I think you're going to like it. And finally, I've collected all the stories I need for the upcoming show with Alton Chung on April 16th. I want to thank everyone that submitted stories. If you don't hear your story on that show, don't worry. I will use every one of them that I can that was sent in. And now, this message from our sponsor. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/RonsAmazingStories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can definitely listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? We've talked about The Fellowship of the Ring and then The Two Towers, books 1 and 2 of the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. This week, we take on book 3, The Return of the King. Most everyone has seen the famous movies, but have you heard the full story? Of course, reading the books is always an option, but who has time to read them all? However, you can find time to listen to it on Audible, and here's your chance to have it for free. Inspired by The Hobbit, Tolkien began writing The Lord of the Rings in 1937. He saw himself as a scholar first and a writer second. The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were largely Tolkien's attempt to construct a body of myth, and their success caught him completely by surprise. The Return of the King is a towering finale to Tolkien's trilogy that tells the saga of the hobbits of Middle-earth and the Great War of the Rings. In this concluding volume, Frodo and Sam make a terrible journey to the heart of the Land of Shadow to face the power of Sauron. This time, we join the narrator, Rob Iglesias, as he tells of Pippin and Gandalf's journey to Minas Tirith.
Pippin looked out from the shelter of Gandalf's cloak. He wondered if he was awake or still sleeping, still in the swift-moving dream in which he had been wrapped so long since the great ride began. The dark world was rushing by, and the wind sang loudly in his ears. He could see nothing but the wheeling stars, and away to his right vast shadows against the sky, where the mountains of the south marched past. Sleepily he tried to reckon the times and stages of their journey, but his memory was drowsy and uncertain. There had been the first ride at terrible speed without a halt, and then in the dawn he had seen a pale gleam of gold, and they had come to the silent town and the great empty house on the hill. And hardly had they reached its shelter when the winged shadow had passed over once again, and men wilted with fear. But Gandalf had spoken soft words to him, and he had slept in a corner, tired but uneasy, dimly aware of comings and goings, and of men talking and Gandalf giving orders. And then again riding in the night. This was the the third night since he had looked in the stone, and with that hideous memory he woke fully, and shivered, and the noise of the wind became filled with menacing voices. A light kindled in the sky, a blaze of yellow fire behind dark barriers. Pippin cowered back, afraid for a moment, wondering into what dreadful country Gandalf was bearing him. He rubbed his eyes, and then he saw that it was the moon rising above the eastern shadows, now almost at the full. So the night was not yet old, and for hours the dark journey would go on. He stirred and spoke. "Where are we, Gandalf?" he asked. "In the realm of Gondor," the wizard answered. "The land of Anorion is still passing by." There was a silence again for a while, then, "What is that?" cried Pippin suddenly, clutching at Gandalf's cloak. "Look! Fire! Red fire! Are there dragons in this land? Look! There is another!" For answer Gandalf cried aloud to his horse. "On, Shadowfax! We must hasten! Time is short! See! The beacons of Gondor are alight, calling for aid! War is kindled! See! There is the fire on Armondine, and flame on Eilonach, and there they go speeding west. Nardol, Erelas, Minrimon, Calenhad, and the Halifirion on the borders of Rohan." But Shadowfax paused in his stride, slowing to a walk, and then he lifted up his head and neighed. And out of the darkness the answering neigh of other horses came, and presently the thudding of hoofs was heard, and 3 riders swept up and passed like flying ghosts in the moon and vanished into the west. Then Shadowfax gathered himself together and sprang away, and the night flowed over him like a roaring wind. Pippin became drowsy again, and paid little attention to Gandalf telling him of the customs of Gondor, and how the lord of the city had beacons built on the tops of outlying hills along both borders of the great range, and maintained posts at these points where fresh horses were always in readiness to bear his errant riders to Rohan in the north, or to Belfalas in the south. "It is long since the beacons of the north were lit," he said, "and in the ancient days of Gondor they were not needed, for they had the 7 stones." Pippin stirred uneasily. "Sleep again, and do not be afraid," said Gandalf. "For you're not going like Frodo to Mordor, but to Minas Tirith, and there you will be as safe as you can be anywhere in these days. If Gondor falls, or the ring is taken, then the Shire will be no refuge." "You don't comfort me," said Pippin, but nonetheless sleep crept over him. The last thing that he remembered before he fell into deep dream was a glimpse of high white peaks, glimmering like floating isles above the clouds as they caught the light of the westering moon. He wondered where Frodo was, and if he was already in Mordor, or if he was dead. And he didn't know that Frodo, from far away, looked on that same moon as it set beyond Gondor ere the coming of the day.
Do you want to hear more? In this splendid, unabridged audio production, all the inhabitants of Middle-earth come colorfully into life. Rob Inglesias's narration has been praised a masterpiece of audio, and I gotta tell you, I quite agree. You can have The Fellowship of the Rings for free Here is what Audible has set up for us. Audible is offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can get Return of the King for free today. Thank you, Audible. And now it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story comes from Mark Valorant, who lives in Chicago. Mark has titled this, My Friendly Orb. Hello, Ron. Thank you for your podcast. It is the perfect escape during this time of trouble. You truly do take us away from today. You've been asking for stories, and now that I have some time to write it, here is mine. It's not a ghost story, but I know how you like orb stories from New Mexico. I recently moved to Chicago, but I grew up in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. This happened when I was 10, and I remember this quite thoroughly. Everyone that I've spoken to about it has been skeptical, but I firmly believe that what I saw was an orb. One night, I went downstairs to make a drink and grab something to eat. I always felt that there was some sort of spirit in my home. When I pick up on this feeling, it never comes across as menacing or sinister. I became more interested in the paranormal rather than frightened as a result. On this particular night by my kitchen refrigerator, I noticed a tiny ball of light. I can only describe it as a bubble emitting its own soft LED-esque bluish glow. I distinctly remember its bubble-like quality. I slowly approached it to get a better look, but as I got closer, it moved further away, keeping its distance constant. I questioned my own eyes at the time, and I rubbed them to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I stopped moving and spoke out that I wasn't going to hurt it. When I stopped, it stopped and just hovered there. I heard some noise upstairs, and a minute or two later I could hear someone coming down. It was my dad coming to check, and as he rounded the corner, the orb flashed and sailed through the wall. I told my dad what happened, and he just said I was seeing things. He picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and took me back to bed. When I had settled back down, I was looking around my room. I watched as the orb came through the wall right into the middle of the room. This time it was more orange in color, and it was also a little bigger. It wavered around a bit in some kind of pattern, and then sailed out the closed window. I never felt in danger, scared, or even worried. If anything, I felt safe and at peace. No one ever believed my story, but I'm sure that this happened. It was not a dream or a hallucination. To this day, I look around my room looking for my friend to return. Mark Valorant, Chicago, Illinois. Well, like you said, Mark, I do love orb stories. I've said before, I don't know what these things are, but I do believe that they exist. There are too many stories out there for there not to be something to this. Whether aliens, creatures, or UFOs, who can say? Thank you for your story, Mark. Our next story has just become one of my all-time favorites that we've ever had. After hearing it, I think you're going to agree. It comes to us from Melissa Starkey, who lives in Tennessee. Hello, Ron. I don't know if my story qualifies as a ghost story or not. I'll let you decide that. I just know that I have titled this My Beloved Black Cat. So you understand how significant my cat was to me. Allow me to go into a little history. When I was just starting out in college, I was having a very rough time. We'd always been moving around a lot, and I rarely lived in one place long enough to make friends. You get the drift. The last high school I attended before graduating, I managed to be there for the last year and a half. I was accepted by a small group of mostly girls. We became very close in many ways. One of our group died in an auto accident, and then, as will happen, the remainder of the group fell apart. I tried to be understanding, but once again, I was an outsider. I'd been going through a terrible depression for some time and wasn't sure if I wanted to continue living. But I had set my mind to attending college, and I would still be living at home. On the way to school that first day, I stopped the car because there was a dead kitten in the road. I couldn't bear to see it lying there, so I got out of the car, gently scooped it up with paper, and buried it on the side of that old country road. I was barely done with this task when I heard a loud crying coming from the general direction of the church across the street. I headed over to see a tiny furball of a kitten had somehow managed to claw its way halfway up the side of that old brick building. It was just within my grasp, so I reached up, fully expecting to get the crap clawed out of me. But the little thing calmed down as soon as I touched it and pressed him to my heart. After that, we were inseparable. He was my little buddy. He comforted me, and I no longer felt alone. This continued until I graduated from college. My life turned for the worse when both my parents were killed in a plane crash. I was heartbroken, but I knew I had to find a job to take care of myself and my sister. I found a good job, but it meant moving away, and that meant finding a temporary home for my buddy. I tried to convince myself he would be okay with my aunt and that I would come back for him as soon as I could. I ended up having to move 3 cities away for a job, and the people that I was traveling with said no pets. So I felt like I had no choice. I got started on this new life, and I called often to check on him. A year floated by. We had to live in our car for a time, but we finally got an apartment and enough money put away to make the trip back to get my cat. My aunt told me he was still around, but was rather vague as to the last time she had seen him. I felt a huge urgency to have him by my side once again, and I trusted her that he was still there. He was not. I looked everywhere that I could think of. I even went into the woods nearby where I had been warned not to go. Rumors were that some people who were not very friendly resided there. He was nowhere in sight. I finally confronted my aunt and got it out of her that she had not seen him for over a month. I ran out of the house crying, not knowing how I could handle any more. I was walking along the side of that old country road despondently and asking for a sign. Suddenly, at my feet was a pile of old bones. In my heart, I knew my cat was dead. I burst into tears. A Native American woman came out of nowhere and asked me if I was all right. We talked for a while, and I felt better. She suggested that I pay a visit to the Pinson Mounds. Pinson Mounds is a Native American Indian site just outside of Jackson, Tennessee. I had heard of the place and had visited there before. I knew that there had been a lot of paranormal activity that had been reportedly seen there. I didn't question why she thought I should go there. I simply agreed, and I went alone. The mounds were beautiful that day, as it usually was out there. There is a winding staircase that went up to the top of the mound in the front. Oddly, neither one of my parents would ever step foot on it. When we visited, my sister and I would always go to the top, while Mom and Dad would stand waiting at the bottom. I made the climb up the mound, thinking of my buddy all the way. As I stared down from the top of that mound, I began to cry. I just wanted to see my cat again. Nothing happened. Not that I really expected it to, but I had hoped. There was a gentle breeze that swept over my face, as if in answer to my plea, but I wasn't sure I believed that. I drove back to my aunt's place in silence. She was waiting for me and had lunch ready. I'd been sitting there for about an hour when I heard her scream at me, "Come quick! Your cat is here!" I was so happy. I raced towards the living room from the kitchen to see a black cat on the couch. But not my cat. This cat was smaller and female. My aunt continued on saying the same thing, but I rolled my eyes and sat down more than a little frustrated on the couch. Then this stray, who I had never seen before, came up to me and rubbed her teeth against the side of my hand and then gently nipped me, just like my cat had always done. My aunt was beaming. "See? I told you!" I was still not convinced at all. Like, seriously, what was she talking about? But as I continued to pet the cat, she looked into my eyes, and I was like, how can this be? This is when things got strange. I quickly decided that I would take her with me, and with that thought, I began to feel happy. The cat glanced up at me approvingly and rubbed against me again. We sat in happy silence for about 20 minutes until I started noticing something very odd. The cat's ghost seemed to be rising out of its body. This spirit was too big for the body that was coming out of it. I glanced at my aunt in confusion, and she confirmed that she saw the very same thing. It seemed to be a struggle, as if Buddy's spirit was trying to stay in that body for a little while longer. Suddenly the two cats separated, and the stray immediately attacked me and then ran for the door, clawing to get out. We could still both clearly see my deceased cat's spirit sitting there looking at us. I kept talking to him until he slowly faded away until neither of us could see him. I was sad all over again, but it was different this time. It wasn't the same kind of sadness. My aunt ended up befriending the stray, and she's still with her today. She has named her Miracle. As I buckled myself into the rental car to make my way back to my new home, I heard a purring in my ear and felt a gentle pressure on my shoulder. My cat was coming home with me. Melissa Starkey, Tennessee. What an amazing story, Melissa, and I can honestly say I have never heard anything like it. As I edited this story for reading, I can't tell you how many chills and thrills I felt during the process. I can't thank you enough for sharing this one. As a cat lover myself, I think I fully understand how you felt. Our featured story for this week comes from Fantastic Universe, January of 1954. This is a strange little story that somehow seems silly, but when you listen, you're captivated and transported to another time and place. I'm not sure if it's the writing of the story or how it's read. Either way, I loved it, and I just had to share it with you. It is titled The Odyssey of Sam Meecham, and it was written by Charles E. Fritch. Now, I'm not going to say any more about it other than it's being read for us by Lisa S. Ware.
The Odyssey of Sam Meecham by Charles E. Fritch. Sam Meecham did not realize that his chance discovery of unlimited power would bring back that which he had lost 8 long years ago. To look at Sam Meecham, you'd never have dreamed he was a man of decision and potential explorer of the unknown. In fact, there were times when Sam wouldn't either. He was a pink, frail-looking person with a weak chin and shoulders used to stooping, and stereotyped thinking immediately relegated him to the ranks of the meek and mannerly. These, oddly enough, happened to be his characteristics. But that was before he discovered the hyperdrive. In his capacity as an atomic engine inspector, his work was most uncreative. He was a small cog in a large cog-laden machine, a government worker helping to produce engines that would send supplies and immigrants and tourists to the U.S. sector of the moon colony. Day after day, week after week, freshly made engines would come sliding down the conveyor belt, and mechanically, Sam Meecham would attach to each 2 wires that led from a machine by his side, flip a switch, and if the dial on his machine read at least 50, he could pass the machine on as being adequate for the job of moon ferry. He'd been attaching those 2 wires in place and watching 50s for 5 years, and it looked as though he'd be doing it for 55 more. Then one day, a defectively wired machine came sliding along, and dutifully, Sam hooked it up and flipped the switch. Automatically, his eyes glanced disinterestedly at the dial showing comparative thrust. His eyes bugged. The needle had passed 50, had gone to the 100 mark, never before reached. Struck the metal projection, bent, and was whirling in a rapid circle. Sam quickly cut off the motor, then he glanced furtively about to see if anyone had noticed. The room was a flurry of men busy at routine tasks, and none of them seemed particularly interested in anything that was going on at his table. Sam checked his own machine and found the tester in perfect working order. He hesitated a brief moment, then flipped the switch again. He was prepared for the whirl of the dial now, but still it frightened him a little. There must be something wrong. No atomic engine could have that much comparative thrust. Yet, the tester was perfect. Sam Meecham shut off the tester and stood very still for a minute and thought about it. His glance fell on the intricate wiring within the atomic engine, and he saw with a start that it looked different from usual. Wires where wires had never been before, where wires were not supposed to be. With another quick glance about him, Sam began copying the wiring pattern on a sheet of paper. He thrust the paper into his pocket as the foreman came up to him. "Say, Meecham," foreman said, "that last engine okay?" Sam Meecham hesitated briefly, then said, "The wiring was a little fouled up. Busted the dial on the tester." The foreman shook his head. "I was afraid of that. Some wireman on the 3rd floor came in half drunk a few minutes ago. That was only his first machine, so the others ought to be okay." He jabbed a finger at the engine. "You'd better send it back up." When the foreman was gone, Sam checked the wiring with his diagram to make certain he hadn't made any mistakes, and then he disconnected some of the wires, just in case. For the first time in years, Sam Meecham felt a new freedom. He'd always been a dreamer hampered by cold reality, a man with his head in the stars and his feet chained to solid earth. He'd wanted to go to the moon when the government first started colonizing, but Dorothy, his wife, talked him out of it. At various times he had felt that secret longing, that beckoning of the stars, but each time he had shelved the desire and turned to attaching his 2 wires of the tester to their proper terminals on each atomic engine, and then, when his shift was up, he turned homeward to face an existence equally uninspiring. The moment he had seen that needle pass into the hundreds, Sam Meecham knew what he was going to do. He had planned it years ago, when he first stood alone in the night and gazed upward at the glittering diamonds that lay beyond reach. Even then, he had known what he would do if ever the opportunity presented itself. In those moments of self-pity that came too often, however, he had told himself that it was only wishful thinking, and cursed himself for being a weakling and a dreamer who did nothing about his dreams. But he had resolved that some day he would go out among the stars. That day had come, and as Sam Meecham went homeward that evening, he felt his heart beat in time with the pulsing light of the stars overhead. But with this new exultation, he felt a desperate fear, a fear that he might again bypass his opportunity, as he had done so often before. Yet he knew that this was his greatest chance, perhaps his last chance. He must be brave and strong, and above all, confident that his intense longing would make his venture successful. "How did everything go?" Dorothy asked when he came in. It was a mechanical question, and he answered it mechanically. "Okay. Everything went as usual." He didn't want to look at her. She had grown plump since they had married 8 years ago, and by not looking at her, he could somehow pretend she was still slim and attractive. She was lying on a couch, wearing a housecoat, and didn't look up from the magazine in front of her. "Supper's on the table," she said. For 8 years, he'd had flat, uninspiring meals that kept one from starving, and no more. His complaints had met with more hostility than he cared to cope with, and always, meekly, he had retired from the scene of battle, wishing he had submitted, and thus avoided the tongue-lashing before which he felt so helpless. Once more, in the surroundings that bred it, a familiar, distasteful helplessness rose to envelop Sam Meecham. It came across him as a feeling of despair and bewilderment, and he wondered sickly if he would ever escape this. Yes, he told himself, clenching his fists determinedly. But he would have to bide his time. Slowly, not really tasting it, he ate the cold, uninviting meal set on the table. Securing the engine was the least of his worries, at least from a commercial standpoint. The factory was turning out atomic engines at almost production line rates, and civilians could easily get them for private use, so long as they operated them at low speeds and within the atmosphere of Earth. That last thought drew a long, secret laugh from Sam Meecham. At low speeds, the government considered anything above a 50 CT as high speed, and here he was with the secret that could enable him to travel at who knows what speeds. He could give it to the government later, but right now he had his own use for it. Dorothy would prove an obstacle, however. She always was an obstacle, and there was no reason to assume she wouldn't be one now. And he was right about that. The following payday, when he took his check and splurged it on an atomic engine, Dorothy was madder than a uranium pile approaching critical mass. "Here I scrimp and save on that measly paycheck you bring home," she wailed. "And you go out and buy luxuries we don't need, if we could afford them. Look at this dress. It's old. All my clothes are old. And you know why? You want to know why?" Sam Meecham already knew why. It was because, as a manager of his financial affairs, Dorothy was a flop. Often he had wanted to tell her so. But the more times he attempted to open his mouth, the louder she had wailed. It was a lot easier just to let her explode and then fizzle out. Even now he had the desire to shout at her to see what would happen. But her shrieks made him grow sullen and unsure of himself. Perhaps he had wasted the money. After all, the engine they had in their outdated model rocket was good for a few years more. But for a long trip through space, it would never do. The explosion was over, and she was merely sizzling. She had folded her arms resolutely, determined that he should cancel the order for the engine immediately. Sam Meecham felt a wave of helplessness surge over him. He felt lost and bewildered. Perhaps she was right. Maybe it was foolish. Here he was, Sam Meecham, 35, whose mediocre living was made attaching 2 wires to 2 terminals, day after day, week after week, a man who suddenly saw a pointer go unexpectedly beyond the 50 mark, and who immediately began having delusions of grandeur. He was a dreamer, but dreams and reality were 2 different things, and sometimes he confused them. He shook his head, feeling like a fool. "Well?" Dorothy's face was before him, determined, demanding. Sam said, "All right, I'll take it back." She smiled condescendingly, like a mother does when a child admits a wrongdoing. Conditioned responses, Sam thought bitterly. That was the whole trouble. This craveness, this kowtowing before any idiot with a louder voice, certainly wasn't in his genes. The trouble was in his conditioning. Started when he was an adolescent. Give somebody an inch and they'll take 2. Pretty soon they're walking all over you, and you've become so used to it, you don't complain. He thought of his job, of the eternal fitting of 2 wires in place. He was a cog and nothing more, a cog that could be replaced as swiftly, as efficiently as any part of an assembly line atomic engine could be replaced. He looked up into the blank, smiling, self-satisfied face of his wife. He thought of the stars beckoning overhead. The stars! No, he said suddenly, decisively. The word felt like a sledgehammer blow in the stillness of the room. Dorothy's vacuous smile faded, uncomprehending. What? No, Sam said, trying to keep his voice even. I've changed my mind. I'm keeping the engine whether you like it or not. Dorothy's mouth hung open in surprise, and before she could recover enough to launch a fresh tirade, Sam Meecham had walked out, slamming the door behind him. He paused in the cool evening and gazed upward. The government had gone only to the moon. Sam Meecham was going to the stars. The next day, he was given the silent treatment. It had begun the night before, when he returned from his walk. Dorothy was in bed, awake and sniffling over the cruelty inflicted upon her by an unthoughtful husband. And when he came in, she turned her back and wouldn't speak. Sam didn't mind that. In fact, it was a welcome relief. But all night long she sniffled into her pillow, trying to win him over. Sam felt an odd mixture of sympathy and anger. "Oh, shut up," he said finally, and stuck his head under the pillow. In the morning the treatment continued, but it was not totally silent, for Dorothy's air of hostility was now accompanied by low, sometimes indistinct mumblings. Suddenly Sam said, "This coffee's cold." "If you don't like it," Dorothy said, and thrust her face near his, "make some yourself." Sam half rose and gripped the table. "Look, my lovely one, I'm the gent who brings home that weekly paycheck you can't get along without. Measly or not, it's good, honest, American dough that lets us live a little decently, and the least you could do is give me warm coffee in the morning." His voice had risen almost to a shout, and Sam himself was surprised at it. Dorothy's eyebrows crept into a bewildered frown, and like one in a trance, she moved to turn on the heat beneath the coffee pot. Sam's heart was beating swiftly as he sat down. Conditioned responses, he thought a little wildly. He'd started it off last night by defying Dorothy, and now, bit by bit, it was becoming easier. All he'd have to do was keep it up, see that he didn't lapse. He sipped the coffee slowly, as if tasting his recent triumph in the black liquid. "You'd better hurry," Dorothy said, looking at him a little uneasily. Sam glanced at the wall clock and began gulping the hot liquid. 10 of 8! He'd have to hurry. He paused suddenly, the cup in mid-air, and wondered. Hurry to what? To those 2 wires, and the tester, and the endless stream of untested engines flowing toward him? With an infinite firmness, Sam Meecham placed his cup on the saucer. "I'm not going in," he said. Dorothy looked at him as though he were crazy. "What do you mean you're not going in?" she demanded. "Just because you've got some mullish notion in your head, do you think we have to starve? You're going in and liking it." "The engine I bought is coming today," he said in a quiet voice. "I want to install it." In Sam Meecham's eyes there was a deadly fire that even his wife had not seen before. She gulped and backed away a little. "But—" "Call up the foreman," Sam said. "Tell him I'm sick." "No, wait." He paused, smiling coldly. That would leave him an out. He could always go back to the job if he changed his mind. He said slowly, "Tell him I've quit." "Sam!" "Tell him I've quit," Sam insisted. That was the thing. Burn your bridges behind you so you can't turn back. so the only road is ahead. Sam Meecham was going to the stars, and he would never return. The atomic engine came that afternoon, neat and shiny and sleek, with all the wires in their proper places, checked and double-checked by a sober human cog in the prison from which Sam Meecham had just escaped. Sam busied himself in the hangar, lifting out the old engine and replacing it with the new one. Carefully, he settled it into its housing and bolted it down. Then he rearranged the wires into the pattern outlined on the sheet of paper. Dorothy brought him coffee. That surprised him, but he accepted it gratefully. Can I help you, Sam?" she offered. He looked at her, perhaps a little disappointed that her face was serious. He said, "Sure you're not just trying to be nosy?" A sharp pain darted into her eyes and she turned away. "Wait," he said. He called himself a fool. It was another of her tricks, and he was falling for it. He put a restraining hand on her arm and remembered another time 8 years ago when the touch would have sent electric thrills coursing through him. Oddly, he felt a small remnant of the pleasure stir within him. "All right," he said gruffly. "All right, you can help." So he was a fool. He'd been a fool before, and chances were he'd be one again, more often than he'd care to admit. In a short while, hours perhaps, he'd be gone, and he'd never see Dorothy again. Somehow the thought was not as comforting as he had expected, and he tried to work off a lingering doubt that rose to plague him. They worked through the afternoon, testing any weak parts the rocket might have, bracing the struts, checking for leaks. Sam found 2 spacesuits in the locker. He'd better leave one, he thought. They were expensive, and Dorothy might need one sometime. With him gone, she couldn't afford to throw money around. Yet he might need it more than she ever would. For a minute, he stood undecided, and then he put them both in the locker. Dorothy came into the room and smiled wearily at him. "It'll go any place now," she told him proudly. In her eyes, Sam saw an indefinable something. Something he might have seen 8 years ago, but mixed with it was a sadness he had not known she could possess. Guiltily, he turned his gaze away. We'd better go in and eat," he said, looking at his watch without seeing it. She didn't say anything, and that was odd. Sam wished she would nag and complain, as she always had before. He wondered why he wished that, when only a short time before he had wanted just the opposite. It was with a start that he realized the reason. He was running away. That was it. He was running away, and he wanted to be deathly certain that he had good cause to run. Slowly, the suspicion was creeping over him that the situation had changed slightly, was changing more. He would leave tonight, he told himself, before he weakened enough to shelve his plans for another comfortable rut. Sam's voice was a little hoarse. "What are you doing here? What do you want?" He had finished loading enough supplies aboard the rocket to last him months. Dorothy came toward him from the darkness. "It's no use," he said. "You can't talk me out of it this time." But she only smiled sadly and said, "I know that, Sam. I came to say goodbye." "Goodbye?" "You're leaving, aren't you?" "Yes." He looked at the ground, studying the darkness. "I'm sorry, Sam," she said. "We started out wrong. Maybe, if we tried again." But Sam said quickly, "No, I'm sorry too, but people don't change." The remark startled him. He had used it occasionally to rationalize his position, had been convinced of its undeniable truth. Yet suddenly he realized that he himself was its living denial. People could change, just as he had changed, just as Dorothy could change. It had been partly his fault when he first gave in to something he didn't want to do, and then to something else, and something else after that. He had helped dig the rut in which he had found himself, taking it for granted just as Dorothy had taken it for granted. Her hair was soft in the same moonlight that had shone 8 years before, and Sam Meecham felt a desire that had been too long unfulfilled. "Dorothy, He hesitated. The decision came hard to him, for much of his life had been devoted to giving in to the decision of others. This was the moment he had been waiting for, and now, at the last moment, he was uncertain. He said suddenly, "Can you pack a few things?" "Sam?" Her voice in the darkness was eager. Her hands touched his, soft hands. "You'd better hurry," he told her. Sam watched her go to the house, and doubts began to gnaw at him. Was he going to destroy his plans now at a whim? He felt an impulse to get into the rocket and leave without her. Yet he thought of the cold emptiness of space, and himself drifting through alien worlds, alone, lonely. Perhaps it was wrong, but he couldn't condemn her for something that was partly his fault. He was trying to become the person he once might have been, and it was only fair that she should have the same chance. Dorothy came hurrying back, a suitcase in her hand, and there was an eagerness about her that pleased him. He helped her put the suitcase on board. "Dorothy," her voice was soft and low. "Yes, Sam?" Starlight danced in her eyes. He pulled her gently to him. He kissed her, and that night, 8 years ago, came back, and in his arms was the young, eager bride he had known, the one he loved. Minutes later, they rose on wings of fire in a slow upward spiral that quickened painlessly. Sam had not questioned the hyperdrive. It had worked in the factory, and it would work here. He watched the needle cross the dial in a swift, steady movement. Dorothy placed her hand in his. "Where are we going, darling?" Sam Meecham smiled at her, confident that he had made the most important decision in his life. He pointed through the forward window. Ahead of them lay the stars. End of The Odyssey of Sam Meecham.
What did you think of that one? I think that with all the turmoil that's going on in the world right now, this is the perfect type story for us. It helps remind us that we're not trapped by our circumstances. There's always a way out, if only to escape from our problems for just a minute. So, I for one, I packed a few things and blasted off with Sam, and it took me to another place. Did it do the same for you? I hope that you enjoyed this story. It was written by Charles E. Fritch, who mostly wrote fantasy and science fiction. Beginning at age 10, he wanted to become a science fiction writer and kept notes of story ideas in his notebook. His most notable work was a short story called Misfortune Cookie. It was later adapted for an episode of the television series The Twilight Zone.
Not so important times in history.
In this segment, we take a look at historical events that may otherwise go unnoticed. We look at history with a fish-eyed lens, giving a perspective that should provide no insight to anyone or any time. But it is historical, or hysterical, as the case may be. Join us now for this event in history. Do you remember the date Monday, March 13th, 1916? It may not ring any bells unless you were alive during World War I and were German. Many people wonder why the Germans wore spikes on their helmets. The Pickelhaube is a spiked helmet worn in the 19th and 20th century by Prussian and German military, firefighters, and police. It was originally designed in 1842 by King Frederick William IV of Prussia. It's not clear why it was introduced, but most think it was a case of imitation of the Napoleonic cuirassier. The basic pickle hob was made of hardened leather, given a glossy black finish, and reinforced with a metal trim that included a metal spike at the crown. Early versions had a high crown, but the height was gradually reduced and the helmet became more fitted in form in a continuing process of weight reduction and cost savings. These leather helmets offered little protection against shell fragments and shrapnel, and that spike, well, it made the wearer a target. These shortcomings, combined with material shortages, led to the introduction of the simplified model, which had a detachable spike. However, this led to problems of its own. Here is an actual event that occurred during the Battle of Verdun during World War I. It appears that battle was rough on German uniforms, and they would get ruined, i.e. helmet spikes falling off. The Battle of Verdun was fought from February to December of 1916. The battle was the longest of the First World War and took place on the hills north of Verdun. The German Fifth Army attacked the defenses of the French Second Army, in which the Germans had an excellent defensive position. They hoped that the French would commit their strategic reserves to recapture the position and suffer catastrophic losses at little cost to the Germans. So fast forward to some high-up German commanders coming to visit their troops. The German soldier at the time was very proud, and they wanted to look good for their leaders. But alas, you remember how I said that war is hard on uniforms? It appears that most of their helmets were either ruined or their spikes were completely lost. So what did they do? They carved potatoes into spikes and stuck them on their heads. The visit was successful, and the commanders were proud of the Fifth Army. Oh, the things we do to make our superiors happy. I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Not So Important Times in History. It was brought to you by Gladys Goodies, great treats for your dog to eat. Now, Gladys Goodies has just introduced their newest treat. Little Bits liver sticks are a great source of vitamins for your pet. These treats are great for cats and dogs alike. They are made from 100% beef liver. Liver is a nutrient-rich organ that most pets love eating. You can get these treats and some really cool swag for your dog or cat at GladysGoodies.com. And don't forget to use our promo code, RONS, to get a 20% discount on all of your purchases. That website again is GladysGoodies.com. Episode number 428 has just completed. Long may it survive. I need to thank Mark Valorant, Melissa Starkey, and Lisa Ware for sharing their stories and talents this week. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, just head to ronsamazingstories.com, and there you will find an amazing number of links that should fit every need. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews wherever you listen. This is what makes the podcast grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's amazing stories.